The snow fell like judgment across the Connecticut hills, and Garrick Vance knew he was about to lose everything that mattered. Standing behind the counter of the silver-lining diner, Garrick stared at the eviction notice in his weathered hands. 7 days. That's all the time he had left before the bank seized the only home his 8-year-old daughter had ever known. Outside, the blizzard of the century raged with a fury that meteorologists were calling the White Death, burying Highway 9 under mountains of snow that looked like fresh graves in the dying light. At 52, Garrick had the kind of quiet strength that came from years of early mornings and late nights. His olive-green quilted vest worn over a brown flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His hands, scarred from countless hours of grilling and cleaning, trembled slightly as he counted his final assets. $47.32. Not enough to keep the lights on. Not enough to save his daughter's future. The diner sat empty except for the ghosts of better times. Red vinyl booths that once hosted traveling salesmen and truckers. A coffee pot that gurgled its last lonely song, and windows that now framed a world disappearing under nature's white assault. The heating system wheezed like a dying animal, fighting a battle it couldn't win against the mountain cold. Garrick moved slowly through his domain, each step echoing off worn linoleum floors. Booth number 3 still bore the small heart his daughter had carved into the table edge last Christmas, back when he thought they'd have forever in this place. Now, with the power flickering overhead and the wind rattling windows like skeletal fingers, forever felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. He was reaching for the light switch, ready to surrender, ready to call it quits, when the sound reached him through the storm. A low rumble that cut through the howling wind like distant thunder. At first, he thought it might be a snowplow, but the sound was different. Rhythmic, desperate, like heartbeats made of steel and determination. Garrick pressed his face to the frost-covered window, squinting through sheets of driving snow. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the white void. Headlights, multiple sets of them, cutting through the darkness like fallen stars. But these weren't cars or trucks. As they drew closer, Garrick could see the distinctive silhouettes. A large bus, listing heavily to one side, smoke rising from its engine compartment. The vehicle lurched to a stop in his parking lot, its emergency flashers painting the snow in urgent red pulses. Through the storm, Garrick watched as the door opened and figures began spilling out. Young women, 15 of them, bundled in heavy winter coats and moving with the careful desperation of people who just survived something terrible. The first to reach his door was a blonde woman in an olive-green parka with fur trim, her face flushed with cold and her eyes holding the kind of quiet intelligence that suggested she was used to solving problems, not becoming them. Behind her came another young woman with dark, curly hair and a white cable-knit sweater, her expression more guarded but equally grateful as she looked through the glass. 3 gentle knocks echoed through the empty diner. Respectful, urgent, hopeful. Garrick looked back at the $47 on his counter, then at the foreclosure notice that would destroy his daughter's world, then at the 15 young faces pressed against his windows. His late wife's voice whispered in his memory. "We'll be a light for travelers, Garrick. A home away from home." He walked to the door and turned the lock. What Garrick didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he opened his heart and his diner to these freezing strangers, was that he'd just made a decision that would change everything. Because sometimes, when you have nothing left to give except kindness, the universe finds a way to give back in ways that defy imagination. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The moment Garrick opened the door, the full fury of the White Death hit him like a physical blow. Snow swirled into the diner, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The young woman standing on his threshold was covered head to toe in ice, her olive-green parka frozen stiff, her blonde hair white with frost. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, 14 other figures emerged from the crippled bus, moving like survivors of a shipwreck. They were all young women, college-aged, bundling together against the storm that had turned their research trip into a fight for survival. Steam rose from their breath in ghostly clouds as they stumbled toward the diner's warmth, their designer boots slipping on ice that had formed faster than nature should allow. "Please," the blonde woman said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Our bus broke down about a mile back. We've been walking for an hour." Garrick stepped aside without hesitation. "Come in. All of you." They filed in one by one. 15 young women who looked like they'd been carved from ice and desperation. Graduate students, he realized, noting their expensive winter gear and the way they carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to having answers. Their leader, the blonde in the parka, had eyes that held quiet intelligence and something else, a depth that suggested she was used to observing more than she revealed. The dark-haired woman in the white cable-knit sweater moved with careful precision, her gaze taking in every detail of the diner as if cataloging it for some unseen purpose. Others followed. A redhead with wire-rimmed glasses who clutched a waterproof bag like it contained national secrets, an Asian woman whose calm demeanor suggested medical training, a petite brunette whose designer clothes couldn't hide the trembling in her hands. "I'm Kaylee," the blonde said once they were all inside, pulling back her fur-lined hood. "We're from Columbia University's Graduate Research Institute. We were returning from a climate study in Vermont when the storm hit." Garrick nodded, already moving behind the counter. "Garrick Vance. This is the silver lining. Find seats wherever you can. I'll get coffee going." As the women settled into the red vinyl booths, shaking ice from their hair and peeling off frozen gloves, Garrick surveyed his situation with growing dread. 15 unexpected guests, an empty freezer, and exactly $47 to work with. He'd been planning to use that money for one last meal with his daughter before admitting defeat, maybe drive into town for groceries that would last them through the final week before the bank came calling. Now, looking at these half-frozen young women, he made a different choice. The coffee pot gurgled to life, filling the diner with the rich aroma that had once drawn travelers from miles around. Garrick moved through his kitchen with practiced efficiency, taking inventory of what little remained. The eggs were long gone, the bacon a memory, the hash browns nothing but an empty bag in the freezer. But in the back storage room, he found treasures he'd forgotten. 3 cans of vegetable soup, a half loaf of day-old bread, and a small container of butter that hadn't quite expired. It wasn't much, but it would have to be everything. The dark-haired woman, Sloane, she'd introduced herself, watched him work with curious eyes. "You don't have to feed us," she said quietly. "We have some energy bars in our packs." Garrick smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Energy bars won't warm you from the inside out. Besides, this is what we do here. We take care of people." He heated the soup slowly, stretching it with water and what remained of his spice rack. The bread went into the toaster, slice by precious slice, emerging golden and fragrant. It wasn't the feast these young women probably expected at their usual Manhattan restaurants, but it was honest food made with honest hands. As he served the makeshift meal, ladling soup into mismatched bowls and cutting the toast into triangles like his wife used to do, Garrick felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. The women ate gratefully, their conversations growing warmer as feeling returned to their fingers and faces. Then the lights flickered. The diner plunged into darkness for 3 heartbeats before the emergency generator kicked in, bathing everything in dim, amber light. The heating system gave a mechanical groan that didn't sound promising, and several of the women looked up nervously. "It's okay," Garrick said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Old building, old systems. They've weathered worse storms than this." In the softer light, the atmosphere became more intimate. Conversations that had started as polite exchanges between strangers deepened into something more personal. The redhead with glasses, Dr. Sarah Chun, a climate researcher, spoke about the data they'd collected, how this storm represented patterns that shouldn't exist for another decade. Kaylee listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of meteorology and environmental science. When she spoke about their research, her voice carried the passion of someone who saw science not as an academic exercise but as a tool for saving the world. "We're trying to understand tipping points," she explained to Garrick as he refilled her coffee cup. The moments when climate systems shift permanently. This storm, it's like a preview of what's coming. Garrick found himself telling them about the Silver Linings history, how he and his late wife Margaret had bought the place 15 years ago with dreams of creating something special. She always said we'd be a lighthouse, he said, his voice soft with memory. A place where travelers could find warmth and hope, no matter how dark the night got. Sloane leaned forward. What happened to her? Cancer. 2 years ago. The words still came hard, but somehow, in the amberlit diner with snow howling outside, sharing grief felt natural. She fought it for 3 years. Never complained, not once. Even at the end, she was planning improvements for this place. The young women listened with the respectful silence of people who understood loss. Several nodded with recognition that spoke of their own experiences with mortality and heartbreak. She sounds like an amazing woman, Kaylee said softly. She was. She'd have loved this. Having all of you here, sharing stories, keeping each other warm. Garrick paused, looking around the diner that had become both his sanctuary and his burden. She always believed that kindness was an investment that paid dividends in ways you couldn't predict. Dr. Chun adjusted her glasses. And now, are you still able to keep the diner running? The question hung in the air like smoke. Garrick considered lying, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. But something about these women, their intelligence, their obvious compassion, made deception feel impossible. 7 days, he said finally. That's what I have left before the bank forecloses. The confession seemed to shift something in the room. Several of the women exchanged glances, and Kaylee's expression became more focused, more calculating. She reached into her parka and pulled out her phone, frowning at the screen. No signal, she muttered, then looked up. Do you have satellite internet here? Garrick shook his head. Lost that 3 months ago. Couldn't afford to keep it. Kaylee stood and walked to the windows, holding her phone up toward the storm. For a moment, the screen flickered with bars of connectivity before going dark again. But it was enough. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, typing a message that disappeared into the digital ether before the signal died completely. She returned to her seat without explanation, but Garrick noticed the small, satisfied smile that played at the corners of her mouth. Sloane caught the expression too, raising an eyebrow in silent question that Kaylee answered with an almost imperceptible nod. Outside, the White Death continued its assault, transforming the world into something alien and beautiful. But inside the Silver Lining, 15 strangers had become something more. A temporary family bound together by warmth, shared stories, and the kind of human connection that made survival feel like victory. None of them knew that by morning, everything would change. None of them suspected that Kaylee's brief text message, sent into the storm on a prayer and a satellite signal, would set in motion events that would transform not just Garrick's life, but the destiny of the Silver Lining itself. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, they simply sat together in the amber light, strangers who had found each other in the darkness, sharing the last of the soup and the first of what would become an unbreakable bond. As the night wore on, the conversations grew deeper, more personal. Garrick found himself talking with Maria, one of the younger researchers, who had been quietly nursing her coffee while staring out at the storm. She had the kind of nervous energy that spoke of worry beyond the immediate crisis. My father served 3 tours in Afghanistan, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the wind. He always told me that the hardest part wasn't the fighting. It was coming home and trying to figure out how to be a dad again, how to provide, how to protect us from a world that suddenly seemed so much more dangerous than when he left. Garrick nodded, understanding flooding through him. The weight of it never gets lighter, does it? That responsibility. He works 2 jobs now, trying to put me through graduate school. Refuses to let me take out more loans. Says he won't have his daughter starting life buried in debt. Maria's eyes glistened. I keep telling him I can handle it, but he just smiles and says, that's what dads do, Mija. We carry the weight, so you don't have to. The words hit Garrick like a physical blow. He thought of his own daughter, asleep in their small apartment above the diner, blissfully unaware that her world was about to crumble. Tomorrow, he'd have to explain why they were losing their home, why her father had failed to keep the promises he'd made to her mother. 8 years old, Garrick said quietly. My daughter, Emma. She still believes her old man can fix anything. Maria reached across the counter and briefly touched his weathered hand. Maybe he can. By 3 a.m., most of the women had dozed off in the booths, wrapped in tablecloths and dish towels Garrick had provided as makeshift blankets. The diner had taken on the peaceful quality of a sanctuary, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping strangers who had become temporary family. Garrick moved quietly among them, checking the heating system, ensuring the coffee stayed warm, playing the role of protector that felt as natural as breathing. Outside, the storm began to lose its fury, the howling wind gradually softening to a whisper. Dawn came slowly, creeping through windows that had been painted white with snow. As the first pale light touched the diner, Garrick looked out to see a world transformed. The White Death had passed, leaving behind a landscape that looked like something from another planet, smooth, rolling dunes of snow that buried familiar landmarks under 20 feet of pristine white. Highway 9 was invisible, the gas pumps mere suggestions beneath the drifts. The world had become a white void, beautiful and terrible in its completeness. But as Garrick watched, something caught his eye in the distance. A glint of metal reflecting the early morning sun. The sound reached him first. The deep rumble of powerful engines, dozens of them, cutting through the mountain silence like thunder. Then he saw them. Black shapes emerging from the white void, moving in perfect formation along what used to be the highway. SUVs. Massive, expensive vehicles with the kind of ground clearance and four-wheel drive systems that could handle terrain that would stop ordinary cars cold. 1 became 5, 5 became 10, 10 became an endless stream of gleaming chrome and steel advancing on the silver lining like a mechanized cavalry charge. Garrick counted them as they approached, his disbelief growing with each additional vehicle. 20, 50, 75, 100 black SUVs, each one worth more than he'd made in the past 3 years, forming a convoy that stretched back into the white void like something from a movie about world leaders or military operations. The women in the diner began stirring, drawn by the sound of the approaching vehicles. Kaylee was the first to reach the windows, and when she saw the convoy, her face broke into a smile that held satisfaction and something that looked remarkably like pride. What is this? Garrick asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kaylee turned to him, her eyes bright with anticipation. This, Garrick, is what happens when you save the lives of people whose fathers move mountains for the people they love. The lead SUV pulled directly in front of the diner, followed by the others in a choreographed arrangement that spoke of serious planning and unlimited resources. Doors began opening and men and women emerged, not ordinary travelers, but people who carried themselves with the confidence that came from commanding boardrooms and shaping policy at the highest levels. The first man to approach the diner was tall and distinguished, wearing a perfectly tailored coat that probably cost more than Garrick's monthly expenses. Behind him came others, women in business attire that managed to look elegant even in the aftermath of a blizzard, men whose bearings suggested military backgrounds and corporate power, faces that Garrick vaguely recognized from news broadcasts and magazine covers. They moved with purpose, these titans of industry and influence, their expressions serious but not threatening. At their head, the distinguished man reached the diner door and knocked. 3 respectful raps that somehow managed to convey both authority and humility. Garrick opened the door to find himself face-to-face with more concentrated wealth and power than he'd ever imagined existing in one place. The man smiled, extending his hand. Mr. Vance, I'm Jonathan Whitmore, Kaylee's father. I believe you've been taking excellent care of my daughter and her colleagues. Behind Whitmore, other parents stepped forward, CEOs, senators, federal judges, tech innovators whose names appeared on buildings and university endowments. As they entered the diner, they moved with the careful respect of people who understood they were in the presence of something rare and valuable. Sloane's father, a man Garrick recognized as the head of a major pharmaceutical company, shook his hand warmly. Dr. Marcus Chen, he said simply. Thank you for giving my daughter shelter. One by one, they introduced themselves, names that appeared in Forbes magazines and congressional hearings, people whose decisions shaped markets and policies. But in this moment, in his small diner, they weren't titans of industry. They were simply parents, grateful beyond measure that their children had found safety in the storm. Jonathan Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope, placing it carefully on the counter where Garrick's $47 had sat the night before. This isn't charity, Mr. Vance. This is an investment. Garrick stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. I don't understand. Kaylee managed to get a message out last night, before the storm knocked out communications completely. She told us about this place, about what you did, about... Whitmore paused, glancing at the foreclosure notice that still lay beneath the cash register. About your situation. Dr. Chun stepped forward. We've been looking for a location to establish a regional research station, somewhere our teams can use as a base for climate and environmental studies. The Silver Lining has the perfect location, the right infrastructure, and now we know it has something even more valuable. What's that? Garrick asked. The right owner, Whitmore said simply. Someone who understands that taking care of people is the most important work there is. Garrick opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was more money than he'd ever seen. Enough to pay off the bank, renovate the diner, secure his daughter's future for decades. But beneath the cash was something even more valuable. A formal partnership agreement, legally binding documents that would transform the Silver Lining into something beyond his wildest dreams. $68,000, Whitmore explained. Enough to clear your debts and begin renovations. But more than that, we're proposing to make this diner the official headquarters for our joint research initiative. Regular payments, guaranteed business, a future that extends far beyond what any of us can imagine. Garrick looked around the diner, at the 15 young women who had become his temporary daughters, at their parents who had moved heaven and earth to repay a simple act of kindness, at the life that was being reborn before his eyes. There's one condition, Dr. Chun added with a smile. You have to keep doing exactly what you've been doing, taking care of travelers, providing warmth and hope, being the lighthouse your wife dreamed this place could become. 6 months later, Garrick stood behind the counter of a transformed Silver Lining, watching his daughter Emma color at her favorite booth, while researchers from 3 universities worked at laptops powered by the new solar grid. The foreclosure notice had been replaced by a framed photo of Margaret, smiling down at the bustling diner that had become exactly what she'd envisioned. The red vinyl booths had been restored to their original glory, the kitchen expanded and modernized, the heating system replaced with something that could withstand any storm. But more than the physical improvements, the diner hummed with life and purpose. A true lighthouse for travelers, a place where strangers became family and kindness created miracles. Through the windows, Garrick could see the research station taking shape. A modern facility that would bring scientists and students from around the world to study climate change and environmental restoration. The Silver Lining had become the heart of something larger, something that would ensure Emma grew up in a world where her father's work mattered and their home would never again face the threat of darkness. As the evening shift began and new travelers found their way to the diner's welcoming light, Garrick smiled and reached for the coffee pot. Outside, snow began to fall. Not the angry white death of that terrible night, but gentle flakes that caught the diner's neon glow like dancing stars. The porch light would never go out again.